The quiet hum of an Atlanta evening set the scene. Inside a pristine suburban home, the Caldwell family gathered around their dinner table. The sound of clinking silverware, mixed with soft laughter, a moment of warmth and celebration as Janessa Caldwell, glowing with anticipation, rested her hand on her stomach. Tonight, she planned to share her most cherished secret. Their first child was on the way. But as the first words of her announcement formed, the air turned cold. The front door crashed open with a force that silenced the room. In the doorway stood Talia Monroe, her 2-year-old son clutching her leg. In her trembling hand, a gun. Her voice cracked the fragile peace. "You thought you could erase us, Deshawn? Tonight, it ends." Panic seized the room. Deshawn Caldwell, Atlanta's revered police chief, froze in his chair, his carefully guarded double life unraveling before his eyes. A family dinner meant to celebrate new beginnings became the stage for unspeakable tragedy. A web of lies, betrayal, and desperation, built over years, came crashing down in a single night. How did a police chief's darkest secret lead to such devastation? This is the story of how betrayal destroys everything in its path. Deshawn Caldwell was the kind of man people looked up to. As the chief of the Atlanta Police Department, his presence was commanding, his reputation spotless. At 45 years old, Deshawn had become a pillar of his community, a beacon of leadership in a city often fraught with challenges. To those who knew him professionally, he was charismatic, compassionate, and steadfast in his dedication to justice. But Deshawn wasn't just a public figure. He was also a husband. Married to 35-year-old Janessa Caldwell, a beloved elementary school teacher, Deshawn's personal life seemed as exemplary as his professional one. Janessa was the kind of woman who lit up a room with her warmth, effortlessly charming everyone she met. For 3 years, the Caldwells had been the picture of marital bliss. Though privately, their journey had been far from perfect. The couple had struggled with fertility, enduring years of silent heartache. It was only recently that a glimmer of hope had appeared. Janessa had discovered she was pregnant. Though just 1 month along, the news had brought joy and a renewed sense of purpose to their marriage. But while Janessa looked toward the future, imagining the family they were about to create, Deshawn was haunted by a secret he had buried deep, one that threatened to shatter everything they were building together. 4 years earlier, Deshawn's life had taken a fateful detour. At the time, he had been leading community outreach programs aimed at fostering trust between the police force and the neighborhoods they served. During one of these events, he met Talia Monroe. Talia was everything Deshawn admired in a person: ambitious, outspoken, and deeply invested in her community. At 32 years old, she was a single woman determined to make a difference, advocating for better resources and justice for underserved neighborhoods. Her fiery passion for change was magnetic, and Deshawn couldn't help but be drawn to her. Their initial meetings were professional, with Talia challenging Deshawn to do more for her community. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind, and that confidence intrigued him. Over time, their interactions grew more personal. Talia saw in Deshawn a protector, someone who listened to her concerns and validated her struggles. He, in turn, found solace in her energy and resilience. Their connection quickly escalated. What began as a mutual admiration developed into something far more dangerous: an affair. Deshawn, then unattached, was captivated by Talia's determination and her ability to challenge him in ways few others did. The affair burned hot and fast, with moments of passion and intimacy that both knew couldn't last. It was during this whirlwind romance that Talia discovered she was pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through their relationship. Talia was thrilled, believing it would deepen their bond, but Deshawn saw it differently. To him, the pregnancy was a complication, a weight that threatened the carefully crafted life he envisioned for himself. Deshawn made promises to support Talia financially and to be there for their child, but with one condition: their relationship and the child had to remain a secret. Talia, heartbroken but pragmatic, agreed. She hoped over time that Deshawn would change his mind, that he would step up and fully embrace his role as a father. But Deshawn's priorities shifted dramatically when he met Janessa Green, the woman who would become his wife. They met at a charity gala hosted by the police department, and from the moment they locked eyes, Deshawn was smitten. Janessa was gentle where Talia was fierce, serene where Talia was intense. She represented stability, a chance to build the life Deshaun had always envisioned for himself. The affair with Talia ended abruptly. Deshaun's focus turned to building a future with Janessa, leaving Talia to navigate pregnancy and motherhood alone. For Talia, the abrupt end of their relationship was devastating. She had given her heart to Deshaun, only to be cast aside as though she and her unborn child were an afterthought. The birth of their son, Kai, brought both joy and pain. Talia cherished her child, but couldn't shake the resentment she felt toward Deshaun. While he occasionally sent money, his presence in Kai's life was fleeting and conditional. Talia's anger grew with each milestone Deshaun missed, each birthday he didn't attend, and each excuse he made to avoid being seen with them. Meanwhile, Deshaun's marriage to Janessa flourished in the public eye. To everyone around them, they were the perfect couple. Two successful individuals building a strong foundation for their future family. But Deshaun's secret weighed heavily on him. He kept Talia and Kai hidden, compartmentalizing his life into neat boxes that he believed would never intersect. What Deshaun failed to realize was that secrets have a way of surfacing, and the walls he had so carefully constructed were beginning to crack. For Talia, the years of silence and secrecy were becoming unbearable. Her resentment festered, fueled by feelings of betrayal and the belief that her son deserved better. This volatile mix of emotions, unfulfilled promises, and unspoken truths would set the stage for the devastating events to come. A collision of lives built on lies, love, and betrayal. Deshaun Caldwell had spent years perfecting the art of balance. His career, his marriage, and the secret life he fought to keep buried. But lately, that balance had begun to wobble. For every careful move he made, the cracks beneath him grew wider, threatening to expose everything he had worked so hard to protect. For Janessa Caldwell, the pregnancy brought nothing but joy. She had waited years for this moment, enduring silent heartbreak as she and Deshaun tried and failed to conceive. When the test finally came back positive, it felt like a blessing from above. She couldn't wait to tell her husband, imagining the excitement they would share as they planned their future. But Deshaun's reaction had been more subdued than she expected. Sure, he smiled and hugged her, but something in his eyes seemed off. He chalked it up to stress at work, and Janessa didn't press him. At least, not at first. As the weeks passed, the signs became harder to ignore. Deshaun was spending more and more time at the office, coming home late with vague excuses. He carried a second phone now, one he kept locked and tucked away in a desk drawer he thought she didn't notice. At dinner he was distant, barely engaging in conversation before retreating to his study for work. Janessa tried to be understanding. Being the police chief of Atlanta came with immense pressure, she reasoned. But the small inconsistencies in his stories began to pile up, each one a pebble in the growing mountain of doubt in her mind. Late one night, she overheard him talking on his second phone, his voice low and urgent. "No, I just need more time," Deshaun was saying, the words clipped and strained. "Don't do anything crazy." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The conversation was brief, but it was enough to leave her mind racing. Who was he talking to? And what was he trying to keep under control? Across town, Talia Monroe sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she gripped her phone. Her messages to Deshaun had gone unanswered all day, and the frustration bubbling inside her felt like it might consume her. She had tried to be patient. For 2 years, she had swallowed her pride, accepting the crumbs Deshaun offered her and their son Kai. But patience could only last so long, and her tolerance for being ignored had run dry. When Deshaun finally called her back that night, the anger in her voice was immediate. "I'm tired of being your dirty little secret, Deshaun," she snapped, her words sharp and unrelenting. "Kai deserves more than this." "I deserve more." Deshaun let out a weary sigh. "I'm doing the best I can, Talia. You know how complicated this is. I can't jeopardize everything I've built." "Everything you've built?" Talia spat the words back at him, her voice rising. "You mean your perfect little life with her, while your son barely even knows who you are?" The line went quiet for a moment, Deshaun struggling to find the words to calm her down. "Talia," he finally said, his tone softer, almost pleading. "I need you to trust me. I'm working on it, okay? Just give me more time." Time? Talia's laugh was bitter and cold. Time for what? For Kai to grow up thinking his father didn't want him? I won't wait around forever, Deshawn. You don't get to treat us like an afterthought. As she hung up the phone, Talia's hands were still shaking, but it wasn't just anger driving her anymore. It was fear. Fear that her son would grow up without the father he deserved. Fear that she had wasted years believing Deshawn would come through for them. Her threats started as hints, subtle warnings she thought might scare Deshawn into action. But as the days passed without meaningful change, the warnings became more direct. If you won't do right by us, I'll make sure your wife knows everything, she texted one night. Deshawn didn't reply. The silence was deafening, a confirmation of everything she feared. He didn't take her seriously. He thought she would keep quiet, just as she had for the past 2 years. She left him a voicemail the next day, her voice trembling with rage. You think you can keep this up forever? Pretending we don't exist? I'll ruin your perfect little world, Deshawn. You don't get to walk away from us like we're nothing. Deshawn deleted the message without listening to the end, his hands clammy as he stared at the phone. He told himself he could handle it, that Talia was just blowing off steam. But deep down, he knew the truth. The walls he had built around his secret life were crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Late one night, as Janessa lay awake in bed, she noticed Deshawn wasn't beside her. The faint hum of his voice drifted from his study down the hall, the words muffled but urgent. Curious and concerned, she slipped out of bed and crept toward the door, careful not to make a sound. Inside the study, Deshawn was pacing, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. His voice, low and strained, carried through the crack in the door. I need more time, he said, his tone almost pleading. Don't do anything stupid. Janessa froze. The desperation in his voice sent a chill down her spine. Who was he talking to? And what was he asking them not to do? The reply came sharp and clear, a woman's voice dripping with anger. Time's up, Deshawn. You're about to lose everything. Janessa's heart raced. She pressed her hand to her mouth, suppressing a gasp. The conversation ended abruptly, the sound of Deshawn's heavy sigh filling the silence. She slipped back to bed, her mind racing with questions she couldn't yet answer. The next morning, Janessa couldn't shake the memory of what she'd heard. The words replayed in her mind like a broken record. Who was that woman? What did she mean by lose everything? Her instincts told her to let it go, to give Deshawn the benefit of the doubt. But the nagging feeling in her chest refused to subside. She started paying closer attention, watching for signs, for clues that might explain the growing distance between them. A week later, while tidying up the house, Janessa came across something that made her stomach drop. A phone tucked away in the back of Deshawn's desk drawer. It wasn't his usual phone, the one that was always on the counter or clipped to his belt. This one was different, sleek and locked with a passcode. She picked it up, her hands trembling. Why would Deshawn need a second phone? What was on it that he didn't want her to see? Janessa began paying even closer attention, piecing together fragments of conversations and behaviors that had once seemed innocuous, but now took on a more sinister tone. The late-night calls, the sudden disappearances, the vague excuses about work, it all started to form a picture she wasn't ready to face. Finally, one evening after dinner, she couldn't hold back any longer. As Deshawn stood at the sink washing dishes, she placed the phone on the counter between them. Care to explain this? She asked, her voice steady but laced with accusation. Deshawn froze. For a moment he didn't speak, his eyes locked on the device as though it were a bomb about to go off. Then he laughed nervously, shaking his head. Come on, Jan, he said, his tone dismissive. It's a work phone. You know how these things are. But Janessa wasn't buying it. Really? A work phone you keep locked in a drawer? A work phone you've never mentioned before? Deshawn turned off the faucet, drying his hands slowly as he composed himself. It's just for confidential cases, he said, meeting her gaze with what he hoped was sincerity. I didn't want to worry you with the details. Janessa wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust the man she had built her life with. But the doubt lingered, a persistent shadow that refused to be ignored. While Janessa wrestled with her growing suspicions, Deshawn was fighting a battle of his own. The phone calls with Talia had become a daily occurrence. each one more volatile than the last. "I'm done waiting," Talia said during their most recent call. "Either you step up, or I'll blow this whole thing wide open. Your wife, your department, they're all going to know exactly who you are." "Talia, please," he said, his voice strained. "You have to give me more time. I'm working on it." "Working on what?" she snapped. "Another excuse? Another lie? I'm not playing this game anymore." As the line went dead, Deshawn leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his lies pressing down on him like a vice. Flashbacks of his time with Talia flooded his mind, the way she used to make him feel invincible, the fire in her eyes that had drawn him in. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by guilt and fear. He thought about Kai, the son he barely knew but couldn't stop thinking about. The boy deserved better, and Deshawn knew it. But what could he do? If he acknowledged Kai publicly, he'd lose everything. His career, his reputation, his wife. Deshawn tried to maintain the facade of a loving husband, but it was slipping. Janessa could see it in his eyes, hear it in the clipped tone of his voice. The guilt he carried was too heavy, the lies too numerous to keep straight. Every moment he spent at home felt like a performance, every conversation a tightrope walk between truth and deception. He knew it couldn't last forever. The question wasn't if his secrets would come out, it was when and how much damage they would do when they did. The evening at the Caldwell household was supposed to be a celebration. The dining room was alive with laughter and conversation, the warm glow of the chandelier casting a golden light over the table. Deshawn and Janessa sat at the head, surrounded by close family members and friends who had come together for a dinner that would mark a turning point in their lives. Janessa had been glowing all night, her smile radiant as she looked around at the people she loved most. She placed a gentle hand on her stomach, the secret she had been keeping bubbling just below the surface. She was finally ready to share her joyous news, that after years of heartache, she and Deshawn were expecting their first child. Deshawn, however, sat rigid in his chair. His laughter, though present, was hollow, and his smiles never quite reached his eyes. The weight of his secrets loomed large, a silent force that made it impossible to fully engage with the joy around him. As Janessa's hand brushed against his, he flinched ever so slightly, a reaction that didn't go unnoticed. "Are you okay?" Janessa whispered, leaning toward him, her voice filled with concern. Deshawn forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just a long day at work," he replied, but the tightness in his tone betrayed him. The conversations continued around them, the clinking of cutlery and bursts of laughter masking the tension building inside Deshawn. He glanced toward the front door, a nervous habit he couldn't seem to shake. Each second felt like an eternity as his mind raced with thoughts of Talia, her threats, and what she might do. Just as Janessa began to rise from her seat, a warm smile on her face and a toast ready on her lips, the front door slammed open with a force that silenced the room. The sound of the door crashing against the wall echoed through the house, cutting through the laughter like a blade. Everyone turned in unison, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm. There she was, Talia Monroe, standing in the doorway, her 2-year-old son, Kai, clutching her leg. In her right hand was a gun, trembling slightly in her grip. Her eyes, wild with rage and desperation, darted across the room before landing on Deshawn. "You thought you could replace us?" Talia's voice was sharp and accusing, her words laced with venom. "You thought you could forget us?" The room erupted into chaos. Gasps and muffled cries filled the air as people scrambled to make sense of what was happening. Deshawn shot to his feet, his hands raised in a futile attempt to calm the storm that had just entered his home. "Talia," he said, his voice steady but laced with fear. "Put the gun down. You don't need to do this." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Don't need to do this? Don't need to do this?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You don't get to tell me what I need to do, Deshawn, not after everything you've put me through." Her gaze shifted to Janessa, who was frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear. Talia's lip curled in disdain as she pointed the gun in Janessa's direction. "Does she know, Deshawn?" Talia sneered. "Does your precious little wife know about me? About Kai? Or did you think you could just keep us hidden forever?" Janessa's breath caught in her throat as Talia gestured toward the boy at her side. "That's your husband's son. Talia spat. Our son, the one he's been hiding from you while you played house like everything was perfect. The room fell silent, the weight of Talia's words crashing down like a tidal wave. Janessa's eyes darted to Deshawn, searching for any sign that this wasn't true, that it was some kind of horrible misunderstanding, but the guilt on his face told her everything she needed to know. Deshawn, she whispered, her voice trembling. Is it true? Deshawn opened his mouth to respond, but Talia didn't give him the chance. She stepped further into the room, the gun now pointed directly at Janessa. You stole everything from me. Talia screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. He was supposed to be mine. We were supposed to be a family. Janessa raised her hands slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Please, she said softly, her voice steady despite her fear. Let's just talk about this. Whatever's happened, we can work it out. Work it out? Talia's laugh was shrill and unhinged. You don't get it, do you? You don't deserve this life. You don't deserve him. Deshawn took a cautious step forward, his hands still raised. Talia, please, he said, his voice desperate. This isn't the way. Think about Kai. Think about what this will do to him. At the mention of her son, Talia's grip on the gun tightened. Her face twisted in anguish as she shook her head. Don't you dare use my son against me, she said, her voice low and trembling. You've already taken everything else. Before anyone could react, Talia let out a guttural scream, her finger tightening on the trigger. The sound of the first shot rang out, followed by two more in quick succession. The room erupted into chaos once again, but this time it was different. The sounds of screaming and crying filled the air as Janessa collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around her. Deshawn rushed to her side, his hands pressing against the wound on her chest as he screamed her name. Janessa, stay with me, please stay with me. Talia stood frozen, the gun slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, her hands covering her face as sobs racked her body. Kai, still clutching his mother's leg, began to cry, his small voice cutting through the chaos with a heartbreaking innocence. Deshawn's world spun as he cradled Janessa in his arms, her breaths shallow and labored. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, meeting his with a look of pain and betrayal. Why? She whispered, her voice barely audible. He couldn't answer. He could only hold her, his tears falling onto her as the sound of approaching sirens grew louder. Talia sat motionless as the police stormed in, her body limp as they pulled her to her feet and placed her in handcuffs. The once vibrant woman was now a shell, her face void of emotion as she was led away. Deshawn remained on the floor, his wife's blood staining his hands as paramedics arrived to take over. But deep down, he knew it was too late. The woman he loved, the life they had built together, was gone, destroyed by his own lies and the choices that had led them all to this moment. The hospital room was cold and silent, save for the steady beeping of monitors. Deshawn sat motionless, his blood-stained hands trembling as he stared at Janessa's lifeless body. The doctors had done everything they could, but her wounds were too severe. She and the unborn child he had dreamed of welcoming into the world were gone. The weight of his guilt was suffocating. Deshawn's choices, his lies, and his betrayal had led to this unthinkable loss. As he sat there, he could hear her voice in his mind, full of love and trust, a trust he had shattered beyond repair. Across town, Talia Monroe sat in the back of a police car, her hands cuffed and her face void of emotion. Her mind raced through fragments of memories, Kai's first steps, the promises Deshawn had made, and the rage that had consumed her in those final moments. She hadn't meant for it to end this way. She wanted justice, acknowledgement, and the love she had been denied. But now, all she felt was emptiness. The news spread like wildfire. By morning, Deshawn's affair, Talia's arrest, and Janessa's death were headline stories. His resignation was swift, and his disgrace public. The man once celebrated as a pillar of the community now faced the ruin of his life. A cautionary tale of how secrets and betrayal can unravel everything. In the end, a secret affair and a web of lies led to devastation for everyone involved. Deshawn Caldwell's double life cost him his career, his family, and the trust of an entire community. Talia Monroe, consumed by anger and desperation, destroyed the life she once dreamed of building. And Janessa Caldwell, the innocent heart caught in the middle, paid the ultimate price for a betrayal she never saw coming. What do you think? Could Deshawn have made different choices to prevent this tragedy? Could Talia have found another way to seek justice for herself and her son? Share your thoughts in the comments below.